So welcome to the Global Network webinars. My name is Alexander Loschke, and I will be moderating this webinar today together with my colleagues Sean Lovell and Panya Yu. Today we are extremely happy to have with us our boss, so Stefan Schweinfest, who is the director of the United Nations Statistics Division. And he will be presenting today on the recent developments around Beyond GDP. Stefan will discuss the efforts by the UN system to develop complementary indicators to gauge dimensions of progress that are not sufficiently covered by the purely economic measurement of gross domestic product, or GDP in short. As an introduction, he will present a brief history of GDP, showing why it has been a great success story of the United Nations. And he will explain what GDP is and what it is not, and what it was never meant to be. He will then reflect on the uses of GDP and the need to develop measures beyond the purely economic sphere. Stefan will then talk about what the UN Statistical Commission is doing in its current efforts to revise the system of national accounts by 2025. And he will explain how that work can and will solve some, but not all, of the current challenges. Further complementary measures are needed, and in a recent report, the UN system has presented some proposals on how such measures can be developed, and Stefan will present those. So let me now say a few words about Stefan. Stefan was appointed director of the UN Statistics Division in July 2014. Under his leadership, the division compiles and disseminates global statistical information, develops standards and norms for statistical activities, including the integration of geospatial, statistical, and other information, and supports the efforts of the member states to strengthen their national statistical and geospatial systems. Stefan joined UNSD in 1989 in the area of national accounting, and subsequently he worked in various other areas such as statistical capacity building, indicator frameworks, and UNSD's external relations. Before coming to UNSD, Stefan studied and researched at universities in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. So now, before I hand over to Stefan, let me just very quickly mention some practical things. So we will first hear Stefan's presentation before we will have a Q&A session at the end. During the presentation, feel free to write comments and questions into the meeting chat. During the Q&A session, we would prefer if you ask your questions yourself to create a more interactive atmosphere. When you do so, please also introduce yourself and tell us where you're working. If you're a little bit shy and you don't want to speak or ask the question yourself, we can also ask the question for you. Just let us know. As always, this Global Network webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Global Network of Data Officers and Statisticians at yammer.com/UNstats. We invite you to continue the discussions on the Global Network after the webinar. So enough from my part now. Over to you, Stefan. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this introduction and for giving me the opportunity. I just wanted to start by saying I really like what you all did here creating this network. And I just saw the number of attendees jumping over 100, which makes me appropriately nervous. I think this network is really one of the success stories of recent years of how we work, because I mean, in an increasingly globalized world, it is important to be connected. But the global statistical system had a bit of, was always well connected. That was not the problem, but it was always top heavy. I mean, it's us, the directors, that are often very well connected and they meet. And now with technology, I think this connection has gone through entire institutions and well beyond government agencies. So to all people who care about data, and I think that's really relevant and really important for the future. So I'm very happy to get a chance to talk to you all today. When I made this promise, I said yes, I'll try. Then Alex was asking me, are you going to have a PowerPoint presentation? And I said, I'm lousy at making PowerPoint presentations. I'm very good at stealing other people's PowerPoint presentation. And then I said, okay, this is an ongoing process beyond GDP. There is so much going on, and I've had at least a couple of colleagues who made really good presentations, so I can mix it up a little bit. And then I got into a problem, of course. I'm capable of mixing different PowerPoint presentations. So I thought I just give you two PowerPoint presentations. You get two for the price of one. The first one is focusing really on what we are doing in the area of national accounts and the SNA Review 2025. And it was prepared by one of my colleagues, the head of our national accounting group, Herman Smith. And the second one is really more focusing a little bit on the Beyond GDP discussion that took place recently in the UN system. So let me lead you in. And I thought, why should you not have the same problem that I have? Namely, that you are pulled into various processes that are going on at the same time, and you're desperately trying to keep them together and make sense of it, and perhaps also guide them in the long run. And I have also one announcement to make. If you connected today to get all the answers in this area, you will be disappointed, because I think I have all the right questions and I may have some of the answers, but I certainly don't have all of them. And one of my pitches will also be that this is a problem that will take time to be solved. And I'm very happy to look around the room here, the virtual room, and I see a lot of people that are significantly younger than me. So I have bad news for you. You may well be part of a very long-term process and trying to help to solve this very complex issue. So let's get started with a short look backwards. Next slide, please. When we talk about the GDP, I always remind people immediately that GDP is only the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of a pyramid that is called the system of national accounts. That is really what we are talking about. The GDP is just one number out of very many numbers that the system of national accounts generates. And I think my favorite word in the acronym SNA has always been the S, because I think the strength is that it is a system. All the information elements that are in there are logically related to it. A little bit of background. The SNA has its roots in the crises almost about 100 years ago, Great Depression, 1930s. So in a way, the system of national accounts and thus GDP was a result of the crisis of that time, which were mostly economic crises. So this reflection started in the early middle part of the last century. The United Nations at its foundations really walked right into it. So even in the very first year of the before the Statistical Commission was born, the League of Nations Subcommittee on National Income Statistics, which was chaired by none other Richard Stone, who's one of the fathers of the system of national accounts, adopted the definition and measurement of the national income and related totals. So again, it was never meant to be just one number. It was a whole system of information. The United Nations Statistical Commission took this then over, and in 1953 we had the first system of national accounts, which many of you know was revised several times in 1968, in 93, 2008, and now we are working on the 2025 editions. So let me just pause and throw in two things here. First of all, a personal note. I just joined in the national account section of the United Nations before 1993. So I really got to see the UN in action. I mean, how in a very consultative process with many expert group meetings, we came up with the SNA 93 review. And then I was part of the implementation efforts over the subsequent years, and I had the pleasure of traveling to many countries and see what it really means to implement a global standard. This is where I always say these GDP, SNA definitely, and hence GDP, is a success story of the United Nations. It brought all countries together around a joint definition, and the reason why everybody embraced the system of national accounts and GDP was because experts from around the world were both involved in the formulation of the system and then in the implementation. So I think we can say that probably over the now five cycles of SNA reviews, over thousands of experts have been involved from around the world, and certainly thousands of experts have been trained around the world so that every country compiles their own GDP. Hence, that's the strength of GDP, and we should not forget that. Next slide. So here we have a little visual of the evolution and even the books there on the side. Next slide. So why are we revising this continuously? Well, like we do that with every standard, but I mean, the modern economy is complex. It changes all the time. We have rapid quality improvements and product innovations. You all know that. The two most important drivers for the current review are globalization. This is what was happening all around us, which has many implications of how we measure national income in different places around the world, and technological innovation, digitalization, the digital economy. You know all about it. But there is a third driver that was at the very beginning in the minds of the people who are now working on the update of the system of national accounts, and that is the urgent need to reflect better economic well-being of people and the sustainability of the environment. So even in the ongoing classical process for which I am responsible also as the director of the United Nations Statistics Division, because we are working closely with the World Bank, IMF, OECD, and the EU to bring that to the Statistical Commission in 2025 for adoption of a global standard. We were aware that we need to look beyond the purely economic frame. Next slide. So how is the updating of the SNA now working? There's still a little bit of text missing. You can see that there are various topics that are driving the update of the SNA. That's on the left, the globalization, digitalization, and well-being and sustainability is part of that process. And the way it works is we have currently over 300 experts across 10 task teams. We work through regional consultations. We circulate papers for review by compilers, the production side and the user side. If any change is proposed, we are asking, can this be implemented? Can this be done? And on the other side, we are asking the users, will that be useful? And one important element also from the sort of classical process of revising the SNA is that the SNA is only part of a much bigger macroeconomic normative framework, the balance of payments manual of the IMF, the government's finance statistics, the system of integrated economic and environmental accounting, all are part of a larger architecture of measuring the economy. And we have the ambition, and we have been asked by many countries around the world to keep these measures and definitions in line. And that's why we're working very closely, for instance, with our expert colleagues in the IMF. So that's an important criterion for us to do this job well, so that we ultimately do not throw at countries different norms and instructions of how to measure parts of the economy. But I know most people are now interested in this, how are we dealing with sustainability and well-being. So let's zoom in on that a little bit. What are we doing in the current SNA process? Next slide. So there are two slides here now that highlight a little bit what we are doing. I mean, the SNA is the overarching macroeconomic measurement framework. That is clear, and it has well defined the boundaries of what we know or understand to be the economy that is globally accepted. And because we did that, in a way, here comes my argument that we have almost become the victims of our own success. GDP has become a powerful measure. It is a measure of economic production, nothing else, national income. It has never been meant to be a measure of progress or well-being, but because it's been around there and it's been there for all countries and it's been known by users and recognized, it has been, in my view, misused to do a lot of things that it was never meant to do, namely to express progress. GDP growth has never been it's the an expression of your economic productive capability. It was not designed to express any ideas of well-being nor sustainability. So that was not the original intent. And one of the biggest problems in terms of use perhaps was that GDP was often used to take major financial decisions. When developing countries, for instance, applied for loans or international support, decision makers in the relevant institutions looked very often at the country's performance, and the one indicator that was always there and right in front and very handy was GDP. And that was often then made one of the cornerstones of such decision making. And obviously, that is very limited. That is not sufficient and has also led perverse incentives by equating GDP growth with development in general. Countries, and I think there are many examples, may have invested into areas which increased their GDP but were detrimental in many other ways. And I mean, depleting, for instance, your natural forests and so is only one example because that clearly increases GDP, but it's certainly not recommended from a broader environmental sustainability point of view. So, as I said, we argue sometimes that GDP has been misused to represent societal process, which it wasn't. Designed to be a negative externalities, they are not well captured in the SNA. That is clear. That was always clear from the very beginning. Next slide. So, knowing this, we have had, I think, the insight that well-being and sustainability are complex multidimensional phenomena that go way beyond the economic sphere. And we may need, or we will need, I'm deeply convinced, measurements that of a much broader framework. Some people now talk about a system of systems integrating economic, social, and environmental statistics and accounting to actually analyze interrelations and trade-offs, which is ultimately what politicians want, because they always ask the question: if we now implement the following policy, what implications, what results will that bring? And in order to evaluate that more comprehensively, you obviously do not only want to see the economic results, you want to see the environmental impacts and the social impacts, and then may be able to evaluate trade-offs. But for that, you would need a much broader system. As I said, some people have now been floating the idea of a system of systems. And so that's a little bit, keep that in the background. And so Um, we definitely can do some things within the SNA. For instance, as I already mentioned, we are integrating elements of globalization and digitalization. And even we can reflect some concerns about income inequalities better in the SNA if we use the tools of the SNA and we open up the SNA and break it down, for instance, by different population groups, income groups, age groups, gender. The system of national accounts in that sense is quite flexible. It remains a system with the advantage of everything being clearly related to everything else, but there are no limits how we can, for analytical purposes, open up the system. And in the idea of satellite accounting, we have even added information from other spheres. And one of the fundamental elements of the national accounts is, of course, everything is in dollar figures and valued, but not even that is a necessary condition. You can do accounting and using other entities, other units like people or natural assets. And this has been done. This has been developed, and the system of integrated economic environmental accounting is one such example, where the logic of the system of national accounts was used and then extended in the accounting mentality by integrating other factors. Next slide. So if we want to visualize perhaps where the national accounting and the economic statistics community is going at this point, this is a nice visual that I like. The traditional approach on the left-hand side, you see the focus on producers and consumers, produce capital, financial capital, goods and services. But we have long extended that accounting framework to include natural capital, ecosystem services, and many elements of the social sphere like health, education, where the expenditures for these elements were always included in the system of national accounts. But you can use the accounting framework and opening it up and adding additional elements of information. So that's where we are in this process. I think I have one or two more slides on that. Yes. So where are we now with the SNA 2025 review? One of my jobs is to caution expectations, because people think that we will have a new GDP and a completely new SNA. We will not, but we will have a much more flexible and broader system of national accounts that can be applied to many more societal and environmental questions. And in that sense, I think we can address some of the concerns of what people would like to measure when they are talking about progress, sustainability, and well-being, but not all of it. So this is my main message. The system of national accounts 2025 will be broader, will be more flexible, will allow more things, but it will not solve all of the issues. For that, we would need a much more integrated framework with linkages to microdata from other areas, the environment and the social sphere. And we will not be able to incorporate that in the current update process. So we are standing where we stand and we are expanding. But there is flexibility in the frequency of compilation and the integration of non-monetary measures, as I explained before. So the areas that we are really now focusing on, and those are the areas where the new SNA will help, is the distribution of household income, consumption, savings, and wealth. Wealth is important. It's not only an income measure. It is also assets are also and have been included for a long time. Wealth in the system of national accounts. We were looking explicitly on unpaid household services work, labor, education, and human capital will be integrated to some extent. Health and social conditions will then be easier to be analyzed. And of course, we have the system of environmental economic accounting already. So that's one process that I'm working on, which is the classical process of national accounting and updating it and adjusting it to today's realities. I think there's one more slide that points you in the direction on the SNA update website. So here you will find a lot more information and more detail on some of the things. So now I have to pause a moment. I was working happily as a director of a statistics division on this and felt very happy that we are using our current base and we are expanding and trying to integrate some elements of the environment and the social sphere. When there was, of course, the voices that we need a new measure that is much broader than the economic measures that we have, became louder and louder, and the Secretary General in his second term now and his common agenda picked that up and encouraged all of us to develop measures that are broader. So that is explicitly included in his common agenda. And the first thing he did, the Secretary General, was to put a UN expert team from various UN entities, from the broad spectrum of the UN, together and ask the question, what can you give me a report where we are, what is already currently measured, why is it successful, why is it not working, and what do we need to do? And that is that famous process, the UN system under the high level committee on program coordination and the chief executive board, that has worked for about a year now to put an inventory to the Secretary General and some proposals. So this is now with the Secretary General. The report is not yet public. And I'm giving you a bit of I hope and I expect that it will become public, but I can give you a bit of a sneak preview of where the UN system is going. And you will see it is coming a little bit from the other side. It's now coming from the demand side of what would people like to see measured. And then we can have a discussion perhaps afterwards. And this is also my professional problem right now. How can we bring what people want to see measured and what we are capable and developing as measures right now? How can we bring that together, and what is the medium and long-term perspective? So we called our report Valuing What Counts, a UN system-wide contribution to the Beyond GDP discussion. Next slide. So what were the drivers? Why do we have this discussion? Of course, you all know that we have various crises, climate change, environment, pandemic, conflicts, inequalities, and GDP alone is not enough. We know that. That's a given. So progress, the notion of progress in the environmental and social sphere and in many other spheres is not yet very clear. So obviously we do not have adequate measures. We certainly don't have one measure, and I'll talk about this in a minute, whether it is suitable and reasonable to expect to have one measure. And then, of course, one aspect is the vulnerability. They're measuring the individual situation, the focus on the human dimension, which is, of course, neglected in the economic perspective, which has as the smallest unit of consideration a household, not the individual. So this is a clear shortcoming of the economic measuring framework, and so we need complements to better understand, for instance, what's the situation of vulnerable groups and so on and so forth. There are some people that don't like GDP just because it comes from the past. I will be frank with you, I don't like that attitude, because if something is from the past, that doesn't necessarily make it bad. If it's inadequate, you have to make an effort to improve it, and I believe we are doing it, and you have to be open about what are the shortcomings and what still needs to be done. Now, this UN group was leaning back and saying, in a perfect world, what do we really want to measure? What do we understand under well-being, progress, and sustainability? And I think we came up with the following framework. I hope this is the next slide. Yes, it is. So on top, we have leaving no one behind, to focus on the individual, and sustainable and just future. So that the orientation towards the future sustainability, whereas the economic measures and GDP, of course, are always measures of the past. So what do we want to measure there? What does such a comprehensive framework look like? We said it has to have certainly outcomes, element of well-being and agency, focusing on the individual. We have to have respect for the life and the planet, and we have reduced inequalities and greater uh, solidarity. So there is a societal governance aspect to it. That's the vision we want to get to, and what are processes that lead us there? Now I can barely read this. Parliamentary governments and proper institutions are one path that leads us to such a better world. Then we have the economy, but we qualified this, but I'll have slides on all of this. And from vulnerability to resilience. So, what are elements of all of that? And I have 6 slides now that give you very quickly a description of what this total vision looks like and what are elements of it. And I will not go into the details. I'll just want to give you a taste that if you step back as a group and you don't look at what we currently have, but you really sit down and say, what would a system that we would like, a vision of the future look like? You come up with elements like this. And of course, in the green part, so to speak, we have climate change, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, environmental inequality, energy solutions that have to be accommodated by such a measurement framework. Next slide. Um, crisis and for vulnerability to resilience, we have to look at social safety nets. I will not read everything here. You can have the presentation. Barriers to participation in global value chains and digitalization, weak skills for the future, lack of economic diversification. So these are all vulnerabilities that we will need to look at in a measurement framework to turn those into resilience. Next slide. Participation, governance, and stronger institutions. What are things that we would like to measure there? Illicit financial flows, good conditions for business, technological advancements and innovations. Next slide. Innovation and innovative and ethical economies. This is we had a long discussion on this because we, as a UN group, we said it's not only the economy we want to measure, it's a certain type of economy, the one that is good and doesn't have negative externalities. We called it at this working stage innovative and ethical economies. So to capture the 2 dimensions, the forward-looking one, innovation, and ethical is being responsible. So you see there are some of the elements that we would like to try to capture. And I think there's one last slide. Well-being and agency, achievement of human rights, health, education. These are obviously all elements that in a much broader measure of progress, well-being, and sustainability would have to be reflected. So what does this mean now? I have warned you, I mean, we invited the entire UN family to the table for this discussion, and that's of course wonderful because the wider UN family represents all the elements of what we call development, from economic development to human rights and justice and good governance, etc., etc. If we want to measure all of this, we obviously, number one conclusion, GDP is not enough. Even an extended GDP will never give us all of that information framework. Second point, we came very quickly to the conclusion one number will not fit, never do the job. I know politicians are sometimes lazy and they want to have the whole complex reality projected into one number. And that's why indexes that I personally don't like, and I can explain you why, are very popular, but I think they never do justice to the very complex reality that we have around us. So the second conclusion was even if we leave GDP behind and try to develop a new measure, it will never be just one number. But we came up with a couple of proposals at least to look forward. So we want the proposal of the UN group is to develop a universal country-owned framework for Beyond GDP. So country-owned is very important because if you calculate whatever clever measures somewhere on the planet and most people don't believe you or try to criticize that number, the number will not have any impact. So if the number, whatever it is, or the framework is not owned by countries, that they see themselves reflected and they have themselves produced that framework or the number, and they know where it's coming from and what it means, it will not have the impact that we expect, namely to change policies and to change minds. The other element that is important for the group is that it is high quality metrics. In statistics, we have a number of principles of what we consider high quality, no ad hoc measurements, but scientific methods and a future framework of measurement of progress and well-being needs to be based on fundamentally sound scientific measurement principles. Um, Whatever we build in the future, it has to be based on the 2025 SNA update process and building on existing capacities and data, because the world out there is what it is right now. There are data out there in all of the countries. There are people that have certain capabilities, and we need to build on that. And the capabilities of countries have extended tremendously, especially in the non-economic sphere, because of the SDG indicators. So there we have a solid base to build upon. We propose the group to the Secretary General that we need a number of steps. First of all, we need a political discussion to set targets and to define what progress really is, because the statisticians cannot define what progress and well-being and sustainability means. That has to be an ask that comes from the user side. There has to be a debate what we as a world understand with these terms, and then the statisticians or the data experts, much broader, can produce the numbers to measure whatever phenomenon we have described and decided more adequately. We came up with a recommendation at the technical level. I just said one number will not do it all. The idea is identifying a dashboard of 10 to 20 indicators max. There is the dilemma that the fewer indicator you have, the more you have a problem that somebody will jump up and say this important concern is not reflected in that short list of numbers. But if you have everything reflected in that very comprehensive vision of the future and progress and all the elements, as I showed in the previous 6 slides, then we have a situation like the SDG indicators right now where we have 240. And that is too much for many to lead and have a discussion with politicians and really have an impact at the political level. So where is that sweet spot? I do not know. The suggestion of this expert group of the UN is perhaps aim for 10 to 20 at this point. And they need to be adaptable, even if we agree on them right now. There needs to be a mechanism to changing them because the universe changes, and they need to be easy and to use and understand. That is sometimes the problem with highly composite indexes, because then people don't understand what is packaged in there, and if it goes up and down, why it goes up and why it goes down. But the power of a number, if it's supposed to change minds and policies, has to be also in its simplicity. We cannot pack too much into a relatively small dashboard. So we always call for disaggregation, because disaggregation is the statistical concept of leaving no one behind, is focusing on the individual ultimately, and being able to address inequalities, which is one of the enormous challenges of this world. Now, one last remark: if it will be extraordinarily difficult to push this process forward, both at the political as well as at the technical level. And I believe it will take time, but good things do take time. If we look back at history, all the systems and things that we have right now also took several years to develop. Our bosses don't like to hear that. And I'm very unpopular sometimes when I caution and say some of the miracle solutions are not going to fall from the sky. If it's supposed to be solid and supposed to be impactful, it will take time. It will take a complex process to develop. And then in particular, if we have defined it conceptually, it will take a process and a true dedication and investment to help countries to implement it and calculate it, because a beautiful conceptual tool is of course not the end of the story. Only when countries all around the world are capable to produce the numbers that reflect that notion of progress and development, then we will be in a truly better situation. I think that's my last slide. So I stop here. I promised you I don't have all the answers. I may have given you more to think about. Key messages: it will take time, but if some of you want to be part of this process, I would be very happy if I have achieved that appetite in you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for this presentation and giving us this overview of what is about to come in terms of measures of progress and well-being beyond GDP. Thanks a lot for this. I have now unmuted, no, I have basically allowed now microphones and cameras for everyone. So this is now the start of the Q&A session, and Peter was already putting his hand up for quite a while. Sorry, Peter, that we kept you waiting, but Peter Popula wanted to ask a question. Peter, over to you. Please tell us where you're working and then ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me first of all commend Stefan. It's a wonderful presentation. I'm Peter Popula from Nigeria. I'm an academic and a researcher from the Polytechnic. The question I want to ask Stefan is this your SNA, System of National Accounts. In your proposition that is better used than the GDP that we are all being known, especially whenever we want to measure national progress in terms of development. Now, and you remember the GDP we have been used to has a statistical model in a form of econometrics model. I don't know whether you are working towards coming out with a statistical model that all these variables could be fixed into, especially in as much as you said that is better in measuring some of the well-being, which is SDG. The major goal of SDG is the well-being of individual in the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Stefan, shall we take a couple of questions first, or shall we? Okay. So there was also A question from Aberash. Aberash, maybe if you would like to unmute yourself as well and ask your question, then please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the first one is just appreciation. I'm very much happy that in the new system, unpaid household work is considered, because by considering that one, it will take into account the contribution of females to the economy. So we have been asking that for long, and thank you for considering that. Because now countries are also conducting time use survey, which really takes into account this contribution of females. The second question is about consideration of the contribution of agriculture sector to the SNA, especially from employment point of view. There are some discussions whether that needs to be considered or not. And in developing countries, the contribution of agriculture is significant. And so what is the idea there? And the last question, in most of the cases, as Stefan, you said it, understanding GDP is very difficult, especially coming to the citizens. Countries may report that the GDP has grown by this amount and this amount, but citizens may not accept because that may not be reflected in their lives. So I think the new system will take into account that one. Thank you.
Thanks, Abarash. Abarash, where are you working? Can you please tell us that also?
I'm Abarash Tariku from Ethiopia. Previously, I was Deputy Director General at Central Statistical Agency. Now I'm a statistician.
Okay, thanks so much. So let's start with those two questions. Or to all others, please, if you would like to ask a question yourself as well, please raise your hand or write it into the meeting chat. So over to you, Stefan. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for your interest. I mean, Peter, good to see you again. And my argument about the better use of the SNA refers really to the power of the system of national accounts that has a lot of elements already. I mean, remember even the current system of national accounts has household sector accounts, which are not always fully developed. So in all countries, but I mean, if you disaggregate information, you can, for instance, disaggregate information by particular population groups, income groups, age groups. There are a number of examples how the system of national accounts has been used to integrate it with population statistics and national income accounts. Also to analyze, for instance, the age infrastructure, how income is transferred from intergenerational, that was the word I was looking for, transfers in a society. So my argument was simply, before we throw the SNA and the GDP away and invent something completely new, which nobody is suggesting, I'm being a little bit polemic. We should use the system that we have to the fullest extent and then see what is still the delta missing and address that. So that's my basic argument. Abrash, thank you for your question. Unpaid household work. I mean, of course, that's always been known as a deficiency, and it is, as you rightly say, an important element for. From a gender perspective, I mean, we have developed the time use instruments in UNSD, and putting that into the system in one form or another to better analyze and reflect. It's not only the household work; it's the whole care economy. I mean, I think with the pandemic, we just saw. Also women making an enormous contribution to all of our well-being, quite literally. With respect to agriculture, I'm not entirely. I mean, agriculture is, of course, fully integrated in the system of national accounts. But I hear you. I mean, and I realize it is an important sector, for especially from a development country perspective. But maybe the labor dimension, because it's also maybe also a situation of unpaid work here, which is not fully reflected, and that hence the focus. If you remember the 5 areas that the current SNA review is particularly looking at, is a better integration with labor statistics and employment to have a much more comprehensive understanding of what is happening in an economy, and not only in the formal economy. What was the last one? Oh, a communication of GDP. People don't believe GDP. I think that is probably if making all these efforts of disaggregation, because it is not important only for a country, for instance, to generate growth, which has many positive side effects for a country and a society as a whole, but also to look at who benefits from that growth. There's quite clearly a distributional dimension to it, and it may be very different in different countries. It may lead to very different social outcomes for particular population groups. So it is critically important that we do not stop describing that the economic apparatus has grown, but we ask ourselves the question, well, where did that growth go? Who benefited from it? And many of those questions can be answered with the system of national accounts to see whether the growth benefited the firms or the households, and who ultimately got the additional disposable income. That can be answered within the existing system, and with additional breakdowns and extensions, we can even do a better job describing these flows and impacts.
Thanks. So we have 3 additional hands up. So maybe we take a round of 3 questions now. So first we have Ashish Kumar from India. Ashish, if you would like to come in, please unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and put your camera on maybe. Thanks.
Hello. Hello, Stefan. How are you? I'm Ashish Kumar.
Hi, Ashish.
I am at present working with the Niti Aayog of the Government of India. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. All good.
There has been a lot of discussion here in India on the well-being measures, and people have been talking that there have been various attempts to do it. For example, HDI came and many others came with the UNDP effort. But none of them could really substitute what people are really looking for, a measure which can completely take care of whatever is not covered by the GDP. What I understand from, so that's just a preface, but I think a lot of debate came after the Stiglitz Sain Fitoussi report, and then OECD did some work on the well-being measures, which have been very well noted. My problems are the following. One is that you are talking of 10 to 20 indicators. Now, do you think with the kind of horizon we want to cover as a GDP plus, whether it will be possible to put it only in terms of 10 to 20 indicators? That's my first question. Second question is, OECD measures, they have a lot of perceptions measured through Gallup and other surveys. What is the position of yours in that? How the UN Statistics Division will take it, because national statistical officers have been taking this position, at least from India, that they are very difficult to measure and they keep changing, and there will be lack of consistency and a lot of problems will be there. So, but these are the 2 major questions which I would like to raise at the moment. And the question is, at the political level, I understand it will be raised that even G20 forum, maybe they'll be again talking about it. So I don't know what will be the final recommendation from them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashish. I will now hand over directly to Papa Sek from UN Women. Papa, please unmute yourself, put your camera on if you can, and ask your question. Thank you.
Alexander. Thank you very much, Alexander. I'm sorry, I'm not in my office, so I can't put on the camera.
No problem. Yes.
Really, thanks again, Stefan, for his presentation. It's really great to see this work moving forward. And first, I would like to really, I think, again, join the first speaker in really, commending the inclusion of unpaid work and the care economy more generally in this work. This is really important, particularly, as you know, as UN Women, this is a core part of what we do. So really, I think something that is, I think, sorely missing in the SNA currently, and really, I think to see. My question is more related to, looking at also, obviously, when it comes to gender equality, we are talking about the care economy, but it's not the only one, right? So currently, for instance, we are looking at the cost of violence against women, issues related to gender and environment, and so on. So, and in that sense, in every single bucket that you've shown, so some of the, the areas that you've shown, gender can be neatly integrated into each of those, whether we're talking about political participation, representation, and so on. But generally, I think, again, if you have 20 indicators in pretty much, I think, even the list of issues that you did show essentially includes more than 20 indicators, more than 20 issues. So the question is, how do we accommodate all of those issues, including, the fact that I mentioned, gender, for instance, can be integrated into each of those 6 issues that you mentioned. How do we resolve all of those issues within a framework that includes 20 indicators?
Thank you, Papa. Thanks. I hand directly to Tracy Kugler from the University of Minnesota. If I'm not mistaken, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks, Stefan. And yes, I am at the University of Minnesota with the IPMS Data Center. And my question is, what thought is being given to preventing continued misuse of the GDP measure? And as you stated, GDP was never meant to be this kind of single number that dictates everything, but that's how it's been used. And all of the ideas for expanding upon that sound great, but it seems to me that as long as GDP continues to be measured, people will continue to use that as the basis of decision making in ways that are detrimental to all of these other things. And even if we get a set of new indicators of 10 to 20 new indicators, I doubt that people will use those in the way that they're intended. So I guess it seems to me it might be worth considering even a smaller set of indicators, and maybe even setting aside GDP in some other, like making a conscious effort to diminish the importance of GDP and elevate the importance of 1 or 2 other measures, because people will latch on to that single measure because it's easy to understand, or it's easy to just put out there in a headline.
Thanks, Tracy. Thank you. And now over to Stefan for this round of answers. Thanks.
No, thank you for those questions. They are really exciting, and so let me try to be short. Perhaps then we can give some more opportunities to ask questions. But okay, Ashish, I mean, of course, you are an expert in. You've watched this very carefully. This all these discussions on well-being measures and the Human Development Index, of course, developed in the 1990s, is now over 30 years old. Has gone also through some iterations. Was a big step forward, but of course also had its problems. I mean, just like it didn't promise to solve all the problems of the world. OECD measures. I mean, I think I hear you asking the question, even though there are so many smart people thinking about this, why does nothing ever stick? And I've asked that question, I've asked myself the question, and I think because we have so far not gotten the equilibrium right between the world out there is complex. To describe it adequately, you need many numbers. Now, the human capability is limited. You cannot digest 240 SDG indicators easily, and even less if you're a politician and you have to take quick decisions and you don't have time. Um, so how do we project this very complex universe around us into a few numbers that are hopefully not too correlated? Another problem. And cover as much of this reality around us, and they are still digestible and meaningful. Is it possible? Can we do 10 to 20? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if we go out and have a political debate, if everybody brings their main political concern, we will end up with 200 concerns. Can we agree on 10 to 20 measures? This will be an interesting political question. Your question about the perception indicators, I know politicians are very interested in perception indicators because people take decisions based on not on the realities but on their perception. If they feel that the economy is going bad, then they will not vote for a particular government. So people are clearly perceptions are important because they can decide elections and so. This is why there have been various efforts to develop perception indicators. I don't want to dismiss that, but I want to just simply say we have not in the UN Statistics Division or in the Statistical Commission started discussing those or trying to have a reflection on whether there is a global uniform way of measuring perceptions. I think because of the diversity on cultures, it will be very difficult to come up with some global recommendations. And so we stick a little bit at this point to our basics and measuring real world around us, whether it's economic, social, or environmental. Papa, of course, your concern with gender is the traditional dilemma if you work with gender, is if we're now talking about a short list of 10 to 20, strategically, should there be a gender indicator in there, or should just every of the 20 indicator be a gender disaggregated one? I think I tend to the second one because position because gender is clearly a totally cross-cutting issue, and as you say, it it permeates everything we do, whether it's an economic activity or we're looking at criminal violence phenomena and security in our society. So will we be able to reflect all issues in the 20 indicators? I don't think so. I think we will have to make some tough decisions at a political level. Whether that will be possible, I do not know. But it can. The one thing I know for sure, it cannot be the statisticians who take the decisions and come forward with 20 indicators, because there will always be a bias to what is measurable or what we are already measuring or what we are what we manage already well in terms of data. So I don't think it would, and the statistician's job is not to decide which are the key societal phenomena that should be measured. We should first have a political debate, and then we look, and if some of those phenomena are already well measured and well covered, fine, and we can move on to those who are not. And statisticians have always been responding to new phenomena. In the 50s, we had an economic crisis post-war, and we developed an economic measurement system. In the 70s, we focused more and more on social issues and gender issues, and the statistical system responded by developing increasingly social measures. In the 90s, the environment moved into the focus after the first Rio conference, and the statistical system responded by producing meaningful environmental data. I mean, you can say in the 2000s, perhaps, our focus shifted to human rights and good governance, and we are in the process of developing good measures to looking at these phenomena. So I strongly believe that the statisticians are capable of responding to policy concerns, but the policy concerns have to come first. That is very important. Tracy, I mean, your question is right. Spot on. I mean, I always say maybe the statisticians are a little bit responsible for this situation because they don't communicate their numbers always well. They are happy to produce them and put them out there, and then they are happy if they are used. But a statistician's job is also to be part absolutely of the discussion and commenting on misinterpretation and misuse of the data. Communicating our products is as much a job as it is producing them, the numbers. Will we be ever successful? Will the universal temptation around a one number ever subside? I'm hopeful that if we have enough complementary measures that capture the other phenomena, but we are not flooding the world with additional numbers, then of course we will not solve the problem. I think we can make progress. I just wanted to comment on one thing that you said. You said, and that always makes me smile, GDP is easy to understand. I'm not actually sure that is true. I think most people think they understand GDP, but if you ask somebody what exactly is in GDP and what is GDP, and you start to ask them 2 or 3 probing questions, if you are a nasty or naughty national accountant, you will very quickly come to the conclusion that people don't understand GDP, but everybody thinks they understand GDP. And I don't know how we got to this point. For me, an important element is this country ownership. But I think people trust GDP because it comes from them, or it comes from one of them. And I think that is, for me, one of the biggest explanations of why GDP has become so successful. But that we need to do a better job of explaining what it is and what it is not. That's absolutely true.
Thanks, Stefan. We are already quite a bit over time, but we still have a lot of people on the call. I would like maybe to still take one last question from Abab Khan from FAO. Abab, can you please come on and ask your question? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I have more of a comment rather than a question. So though capturing additional aspect will certainly enrich the GDP as a measurement tool for diverse national policy making. However, it is also a fact that not many countries, especially developing ones, are yet to implement the 2008 SNA, and some are, still using the very old structure of SNA from the 60s and the 50s. So expanding the scope will mean collecting, analyzing, and reporting additional data and statistics, which doesn't come in cheap. and thus even capturing 10 to 20 additional aspects will be prohibitive for many developing countries. And my second comment is that or maybe a question. Shouldn't we be more focused on subnational disaggregation of the SNA for more sub-regional or subnational policy making rather than introducing a new or additional aspect?
Thank you, Abab. Stefan, your last answers.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Bob. I mean, you're pushing some dangerous buttons. I mean, these are all my favorite topics, and I can go on for hours, but I will try not to. Your first point, yes, this is the ultimate international norms. Are they to be updated quickly or slowly? This is an eternal dilemma. If you do it quickly, the norms are in line with the ever-changing reality around us. But the numbers may not be produced because many countries just need a lot of time. I mean, even European countries took, I think, 6 years by 2014. Maybe somebody from Europe is on the call who knows it more exactly, to implement the 2008 SNA. So I just don't want to leave that impression that it's only the developing countries that need time. Everybody needs time if you update a complex data system and so on and so forth. So there's always this is the statistician's ultimate dilemma. If you change the measurement every year, you don't produce a time series and you don't understand development. So, I mean, sometimes you have to keep something constant for a number of years so that you can actually make meaningful assessments about development. So, your question about a few numbers, I I am a believer in data systems. I think I said that at the very beginning, and we will never throw away all of the underlying information. So I think our biggest challenge is actually to create what I always call data architecture and then a good data culture. In the data architecture, I mean that the top data that we start paying attention to are well connected to the entire base of much more information. And we will always have that, and we will always need that, because every policy problem we look at, immediately you will ask the question, how can I disaggregate that? Where is this coming from, etc. And if I may just jump to your last question, on the subnational, I couldn't agree more with you. And I mean, as you may know, in our division, we've had now for 10 years also a program on geospatial information, not only on statistical numerical information. And I have become the global voice for the marriage between the geospatial information and statistical information. It's not one against the other or one is better than the other. It's the only question we have is how do we integrate those formidable information systems most effectively so that we understand both what's happening at the national, regional, and global level, but we can also drill down to the local level, subnational level, because this is critically important, because many of the developmental issues are happening at the local level and will find their solutions at the local level. And I think that's the exciting dimension about geospatial information and integration. And so, and then the last point I wanted to pick up from your question is this, my favorite word, and it's a good way to conclude this session, I believe, is the key word of investment. I mean, data are not cheap. They are not falling from the sky, in particular if they are high quality data and good data, processed data, data that are coming from a scientific process, the collection process, etc., etc. Data are not cheap, and if they are cheap, be careful. Ask where they are coming from. I'm not saying they are necessarily bad. There may be innovative data sources that are much more economical, and we are looking into that. But overall, to create an integrated data architecture and a data system will always require an investment. And it will in particular also require global solidarity, that the countries that are more advanced support other countries and transfer knowledge and technology so that we all benefit from one world and one data system, because the world is global. We do not only produce data for our own country, we also produce data for consumption by other countries. And that can only work if we have a United Nations framework, and we have standards and norms, and we can compare data, and we can learn from each other. And so this is the fun, but that will require money. And I always say I'm not a beggar, that I'm asking for gifts. It is an investment, because if you have better data systems, you will make better decisions. You will ultimately save money by not, let's say, building a bridge in the wrong place, quite literally. But we as statisticians also have to learn much better to make that pitch. We cannot just stand there and say we will produce good data. We need to look at the use of the data. We need to look at the value proposition of the data to the return. We need to answer the questions of what is your return to investment, because people who have money, they stand there and they say, I am willing to give you that money, but you have to be able to make that pitch. If I give you that money, what is going to be better on my side? And I think that is something that we are learning, but we have to become much better at it.
Thanks, Stefan. Thanks to everyone for asking all those very interesting questions. And thanks, Stefan, for this really great presentation. I would like now to ask everyone, if they can, please switch your camera on for a few seconds and unmute yourself, and give Stefan a big round of applause. That would be really great. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Too kind. Thank you for your interest.
Thanks so much, everyone. So the slides and the recording of this Global Network webinar will be shared on the Global Network of Data Officers and Statisticians. Please, if you haven't joined yet, have a look into the meeting chat. I have put a link there how to get to the Global Network. There are some info pages, and there's also information on how to join. So thanks everyone for joining today. See you next time. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, and thank you for your interest. Thank you, Alex, and everybody.
Bye.